everybody, and welcome back to Think Big Code Small. Today we're going to start a series where we go over what seems like a pretty simple question. Can you measure developer productivity? And in today's video, specifically, we're going to talk about, are developers blue-collar workers, and what really is productivity when you start to think about it. Join us while we dig in. I guess the first place to start is, how do we actually define developer, or not even developer productivity? How do we define productivity in and of itself?
Right. What is productivity, right? I wrote a lot of articles before, and I always like to look up the word and see what it means. And when I started, the word productivity is actually from 1899. In economic circles, it was they defined productivity as a rate of output per unit. And the concept made sense, right, from economics point of view and a business management point of view, because it allowed them to define the efficiency of the input, or the labor, materials, and capital that was put into something that was converted to an output, like the goods and services that was provided. It was basically the foundation for the Industrial Revolution, or the Industrial Age. And it was an ability to focus on optimizing the production, or the processes for the production of all of the components they were building, right? How do they change the way the factories were working? How did they, mechanize those processes so it was automated to take a labor of unit from 1 to make it 100 with the same labor force?
An interesting thing to add in there is this was the first time really where productivity mattered in a lot of ways, where you didn't have gigantic factories. I mean, maybe a little bit, but you didn't have gigantic factories and the kind of the behemoth company that's wrapped around it. The Industrial Revolution was really the beginning of kind of management in that style. And, it also was the rise of things like scientific management and other things as well, of how do you kind of start to optimize around the production of goods and services in a kind of mass production way.
Right. It was even like microservices concept, right? But it was an idea of taking something and breaking it down to each of the smaller components, and then optimizing the building or the construction of those components, and then putting it all back together on the end, but in a way that instead of taking weeks to build one, we could take weeks to build hundreds or thousands or more.
Yeah. And, you go back to kind of Henry Ford as well with the production line, and how do you go about, not only necessarily building things more productive, but how do you actually go about building with better quality, with, making sure that, there was always the joke about IKEA where it's like, there's always like 16 pieces left, but you're fine. But how do you make sure that everything's getting into there and you're building them with higher quality? They're better, they last longer, and you can start to iterate and make them better over time. And without some of the thinking around productivity, a lot of that stuff kind of goes away in some ways.
And I think what's important, especially to our discussion that we're having today, is this whole Industrial Revolution was the 18th century. It was the 19th century. It was a very specific time period and a certain growth, right? A specific type of growth for what we were doing. It was the Industrial Revolution. It was what it was focused on. We are not in the Industrial Revolution now. We're in the information age, right? We're in the digital era, the informational age. We're not in the industrial. And the problem is we're trying to take the understanding of productivity from then and kind of shoehorn it into the information age that we're in today.
The complexity there, where if you're running a factory that creates widgets, whatever those widgets might be, there is a very clear of, this is the input, these are the output, this is the time. And so you can start to come up with ways of being able to optimize around that because you have clear metrics. In the information age, it's very digital, it's software driven, it's all of these other pieces, and the kind of inputs coming in and outputs going out are not nearly as clear as they once were.
And the influences of us being knowledge workers, so the knowledge work of today, and the mere fact of we're focused on innovation. And yes, every age had a version of what it was doing, what was considered innovation. But the fact that what we have is innovation. We're trying to change the way the world is today in an information age. So the work is different. The way we look at it is different. And like you said, the input might be measurable, but the output is not. It is different. The definitions of productivity are not the same.
It's complexity. And the what we're doing now is very, very complex. Writing software is complex. Having distributed networks is complex. Just even the deployment of something is far more complex now than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, the types of outputs have evolved themselves. To your point before, we're not just building sewing needles. It's not that simple anymore.
Interesting that you brought up kind of sewing needles. You go back to the beginning, the very first computer was a automated loom to create carpets. And it was the first time that anybody used punch cards. And so you started adding complexity where before it was someone literally sewing and they were essentially the computer. But now you started to add in these other layers and now it's becoming far, far, far more complex. There's more variables and everything else that goes into things that make it harder and harder to measure productivity.
The shift to the information age requires a new understanding of productivity, and it requires organizations to understand the importance of reflecting on the value of creation, the quality of the work, and the ability to innovate and adapt to new challenges, because the outputs, like we said, are different. The work that we're doing is different because it's the information age. It's not the industrial age. So we're not saying, right, the productivity is not needed or measurement is not needed even, right? But it's different.
Yeah, there's an interesting quote from Martin Fowler, who is one of the signers of the Agile Manifesto. But his quote is, productivity, of course, is something you determine by looking at the input of an activity and its output. So to measure software productivity, you have to measure the output of software development. The reason why we can't measure productivity is that we can't measure output. And I really love that quote, and we're going to dive deeper into this later, but tying, how do you tie software development, the work that's being done, into outcomes and impacts to an organization? And that to me is, whether you go back to kind of the industrial age and those factories, how do you start to tie that impact together is one of the roots of kind of where we're going with developer productivity and all these other pieces. It's pretty interesting.
There was another quote I liked. It was from Bill Gates, and he was shown the absurdity of misapplying manufacturing metrics to, intellectual endeavors, basically the work we're doing today. And he said that measuring software productivity by lines of code is like measuring progress on an airplane by how much it weighs. So it's measuring the wrong things, right? And expecting to understand exactly what's happening, which is almost what we're doing. And to no one's fault, but again, we're matching the definition of the wrong era, maybe.
To me, it goes back to complexity. And, how do you start to understand a system that's so complex? And there's a ton of different input variables. There's a ton of output variables. And, for anybody that's ever studied or looked into kind of AI ML models, there's a ton of different input variables. And as you tweak them, you never know exactly what you're getting until you're going to look at the output. And, there's another interesting quote here from Pamela Zav. I have no idea to pronounce your name. Sorry, I butchered it. Zave for anybody who's interested.
Yeah. Just to throw into that too, if nobody knows who she is, she's an American computer scientist who works over at Princeton University. She's known for work in requirements engineering, telecommunications, and some other stuff. But really, really cool quote that we found.
But her quote in here is, the purpose of software engineering is to control complexity, not create it. And this is a really insightful view into organizations themselves. And when you think about developer productivity, they're trying to drive clearly more productivity from software development. But are you actually focused on the right things? Are you trying to make the business simpler? Are you trying to drive it forward? Or are you trying to just beat people over the head to get them to type faster? And that's a lot of what we're going to dig into as we kind of go along.
I like the statement that software developers are the architects of the digital age. And I think this is one of the problems we find in this space is a misunderstanding of what that role is and what does it mean, both in the age we're in, the information age, as well as their role inside of an organization. We keep trying to pigeonhole it because for most people, it is what it is, right? They don't understand technology as a whole. So they don't know where to place, software developers today, architects, engineers, technologists, even more so than I think some of the other roles like BAs and PMs and things like that. Those can align a little more maybe to a business side. So there's some clarity of understanding where like software developers, for most people, they just don't understand the job. And that causes a lot of confusion.
A look at, how do people try to kind of correlate workers or group them? And, I'm sure we've all heard of kind of white collar workers, blue collar workers, but where do software engineers fall into that space? And, when people think of kind of blue collar, it's really referring to people that are kind of the trades, manual labor, those types of things, and work that is generally kind of physical in nature, where the white collar folks are generally, referred to as professionals or managerial, administrative, those types of things. And where does a developer actually fit into this model is a bit up for debate.
And this was an interesting list, and Wikipedia had a page, of course, but we had everything from no collar and new collar to, like you said, is it an idea of a white collar? Now they had gray collar. So if you were working past retirement age, and gold collar, and then silver, I thought was interesting, right? Refers to bots and AIs that are now part of the workforce. This was a list well beyond what I knew was available.
Yeah. But I would also throw in there, a little bit of a deeper dive into gold collar, which is one I wasn't aware of until I started actually researching some of this. But that term is really around the kind of skilled workers, the people that are, really advanced in their field. A lot of people would say doctors, lawyers, engineers, those types of folks. And yeah. And so, where do you think software engineers actually kind of fit into this is a really interesting question of, are they a blue collar? Are they a white collar? Are they gold collar? I don't know.
Yeah. And I think that is an interesting question because as we go through these deeper dive in our next three components of this post here, there's different ways to think about it. Are they blue collar, gold collar, white collar, or a combination of all of them? There was an article, right, in Wired magazine from Clive Thompson who asked that same question, right? And he was saying that stereotypical coder, like we all see in the movies and we think, is we basically think all of the world is Silicon Valley. If you're not a technologist, you think everybody's working in Silicon Valley, making millions of dollars and building the next AI, or they're building the next Google, right? That's what we all see. But it's not true. A lot of the roles, over 90% of the jobs is somebody making sure that your bank systems are running, or, the software that you use when you play your game online is working the way it should. Like day-to-day work in an organization, we're just making sure stuff is running. Things are working the way they're supposed to. And most of the time people would say that is maybe more of a blue collar. But at the same time, they are highly skilled technologists for the most part, which then negates the blue collar. And it says maybe you're right? Maybe it's a white collar or even a gold collar, depending on the role, the type, or the level of the seniority.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty good kind of bifurcation across the kind of the software development community. And I think it kind of splits between blue collar and gold collar. I think in the past, people would consider it to be more white collar, but I think that's really changed. And there are armies of people that are out there working, I would kind of throw into the blue collar. It's, I have this Java app that I have. It's running this system for a large company. It is not sexy. It is not innovative. It is not anything. It's a thing that we're just using and running, and it's providing its thing. And I just sit here and I write out my Java code all day. I go through my agile ceremonies and I go home at the end of the day, no more fulfilled than when I got there in the morning. But
you put your 40 in and you go home.
Yeah. Yep. And when you think of the blue collar worker of the past, it's you punch your card in the morning and you leave when the whistle blows in the evening. And there is a segment of the software development community that is that. But there's also the kind of gold collar, the people that are working at the high end places inside of Silicon Valley that are building these new startups, that are starting companies and really driving the technology forward. And then there's the people that are, kind of working alongside of them that are kind of gold collar to bees, and so I think you have to kind of split up that community a little bit, because those two sets of people are very different, and you need a different set of management for each of those kinds of things, in my opinion.
Right. But even the productivity, the effectiveness, what they're working on, how they're working on it, how you're measuring, all that changes depending on that type of role.
Yeah, because in the end, I don't believe developers are line workers. I don't think that's necessarily totally true, but it is in some ways, in some areas of some organizations that are kind of more treated that way.
But you and I had an interesting discussion on that. We're going to cover it in a later episode that we're recording. But just to touch on it a little, it was an interesting idea of, as a team, as a whole, where do those roles fit? Mm-hmm. Because my recommendation or my thought process was around like a kitchen. And if you were aligning it more like people in a kitchen and you were thinking from a team level, then we would have all of those different versions of those roles on teams and be highly effective, if the team was working highly effective anyway.
It takes a team to do any of these things. The question is, what does that team look like? What is the composition? And how do you make sure that team is driving to success and delivering on the things that are necessary?
So I'll ask you the next question, really, because now we kind of understanding somewhat of productivity and where it is, where we're kind of coming, how it's changed, all the components. But why are organizations pushing so much? And it seems even more so, especially into this year, right? Why are we pushing so much so in this space?
Thanks for joining us today. So what do you think? Are devs blue collar? Are they gold collar, white collar, or something completely different? Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget, we'll be answering more of these questions as we go along. So please subscribe and so you don't miss anything.